Everything
Barfield
about
says
it.
drugs led her to prison. She became addicted to tranquilizers, she says, during a rocky period in her life.
The last 10 years was just like that. Years of a drug nightmare. Days of not knowing where you are or what you've done. I'm sorry for the hurt that I've caused so many people. Today, if it were possible, I wish that I could take every bit of hurt on myself.
Once again, it's Murder and Mayhem Monday, so welcome back. My name is Franklin James, the serial author, and I hope you all have a mayhem-less week. Now today, we'll be stepping into the life and mind of Velma Barfield, a woman whose unassuming demeanor concealed a string of poisonings that ultimately led to her execution in 1984. And as an aspiring crime thriller author and student of psychology, I'm not only interested in what she did, I'm interested in uncovering why. How does an unsuspecting, ordinary woman from rural North Carolina become one of the nation's most infamous serial killers? Let's start by exploring her upbringing and her adulthood to get some insight on her decision making and why she went down the path she chose. Velma Barfield was born Faye Velma Bullard on October 29th, 1932. She was raised in a small tobacco farming town of South Carolina's borderland. Her father was a strict, controlling man who was known for his violent temper. In fact, because of her father's violent temper, Velma admitted that she and her mother endured relentless abuse, which is significant from a psychological standpoint. We know from psychological research that chronic exposure to abuse during one's formative years disrupts emotional regulation, attachment formation, and how an individual processes empathy and moral reasoning. It creates an unstable internal world, one where trust is scarce and control is sought compulsively, which can lead to the development of antisocial personality disorder. Now, Velma also grew up in deep poverty. For her, life was a mix of scarcity and fear, and yet she conformed, excelling in school, appearing dutiful, even prim. Her classmates, they described her as polite and soft spoken. But remember, trauma isn't always visible. Sometimes it whispers in compulsions and secrets. Now, when Velma was 17, she dropped out of school, and she escaped her abusive home by marrying a man named Thomas Burke. And their relationship initially offered stability. For a while, they lived harmoniously, and they even had two kids together. But you know what they say, all good things must come to an end. And soon her husband Thomas spiraled into alcoholism. Velma herself was struggling with chronic pain after her hysterectomy, and she became addicted to prescribed drugs. So at this point in her life, we have unresolved trauma, chronic pain, substance dependency, and marital instability, which is a known cocktail for what we call maladaptive coping strategies. And poison would become her outlet. By the 70s, death started following Velma. Her husband, Thomas Burke, he passed out after an argument and died in a house fire. And then her mother, Lillian Bullard, died suddenly in 1974. And then her second husband, Jennings Bearfield, died a year later. And then came an alarming string of deaths, including her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, an elderly man she was caring for. Even the death of her own mother would later be revisited under suspicion. I mean, Velma Barefield's pattern was insidious. She liked using arsenic, which is a poison that mimics symptoms of natural illness, especially in elderly victims. But why use poison? Well, poisoning is often chosen by perpetrators who desire control, but they want to avoid direct confrontation. Poison is considered stealthy and distancing. It allows the killer to remain close, even nurturing, while silently wielding lethal power. For Velma, who grew up powerless and vulnerable under her father's hand, poison offered her some semblance of power and control. Velma Barfield likely felt godlike because she got to choose who lived and who died. But there's an important distinction here. Velma Barfield wasn't driven by bloodlust or sadism in a traditional forensic sense. Her motives, while deplorable, were often tied to financial desperation, fear of abandonment, and a fractured moral compass shaped by years of abuse and addiction. This is why she's often categorized under caretaker or Black Widow typologies in forensic literature, killers who exploit proximity and trust. Now, when she was finally arrested in 1978 for the murder of Stuart Taylor, she confessed to multiple poisonings. And during interviews and trial proceedings, she appeared remorseful, citing her addiction and her deep seated guilt. But here's the clinical question: was she displaying genuine remorse or strategic contrition? Was she just playing the part? And from what I've discovered, it's likely both. Velma Barfield wasn't psychotic in the classic sense. Her psyche vows at the time suggested borderline personality traits, such as emotional instability, chronic feelings of emptiness, and manipulativeness, often rooted in early trauma. So her remorse was real, but it coexisted with a lifelong pattern of rationalizing harmful behavior. Now, on November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield became the first woman to be executed in the United States after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. She was also the first woman to die by lethal injection, and reportedly, she spent her final years in prison as a devout Christian counseling fellow inmates. So, when we examine Velma Barfield's case through a psychological lens, we see a portrait of pathology layered with vulnerability. We see a woman whose early exposure to violence warped her understanding of control and connection, a woman whose addiction magnified her impulsivity, and whose crimes, while methodical, stemmed less from sadism and more from a desperate, tragic need for survival. But this does not excuse her actions because what she did was heinous and awful. And in forensic psychology, context is what turns headlines into understanding. Now, I do believe Velma Barfield was predisposed to violence and addiction. And unfortunately, she grew up experiencing these things as well. And her chilling case is a reminder that people are going to hide pain behind an innocent smile, even though they're desperately yearning for help. But I do want to thank you all for tuning in. And I do ask that you stab that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment, let me know what you think about Velma Barfield. Share this video out there, hit that bell for notifications, and if possible, avoid mayhem.